Some segregation of the races had always been a part of life in Louisiana, whether by law or custom. But challenging those laws and customs was also a time-honored tradition here, especially among the Black Creole community. One of the first so-called Jim Crow laws passed in Louisiana required that whites be granted their own passenger cars on trains, separate from blacks. Seeking to prove the law unconstitutional, Black activists in New Orleans formed the Comité des Citoyens, or Citizens Committee. The group carefully constructed a test case. It was one of the first such challenges ever mounted anywhere in America. Homer Plessy would be the man chosen to defy the legal stronghold of white supremacy. And all he had to do was buy a ticket to ride.
Homer Plessy could pass for white. And what they did is they put Plessy on a railroad car in Covington. And then other members of the committee purposefully informed the white conductor, don't you know this person is Negro or colored? So he could be thrown off the car so that his ticket into this car would be an abrogated contract.
In what would become the most important legal challenge to ever come from Louisiana, the case went to the United States Supreme Court. Plessy's attorneys claimed that his 14th Amendment right to equality before the law had been violated. They argued that there could not be different categories of citizenship for Americans. The Supreme Court did not agree. In 1896, they ruled that the notion of separate but equal was a suitable means of addressing the question of race in America.
That is inequality in itself, and few people were willing to stand up and say it when it should have been said from the moment that the ink dried on the pages of the Supreme Court decision.
Homer Plessy had lost his case. In coming years, blacks would lose even more, including the right to vote. Bourbon lawmakers in Louisiana and throughout the South amended their constitutions in order to make it virtually impossible for blacks to qualify for voting.
The black vote literally within roughly about an 8-year period declined by 99%. There were approximately 145,000 black voters in 1896 before the disfranchisement laws are enacted. By 1904, after the disfranchisement laws, poll tax, literacy requirements, you had roughly about 1,500 black voters in the entire state. I mean, it's just overwhelming.
The object was to eliminate the vote of the ignorant and debased Negro population, and do it by such legislation as would be efficient and in accordance with the demands of enlightened statesmanship.
But what gets lost sometimes in the shuffle is that not only were blacks removed from the voting rolls, but so were whites.
In 1897, there were some 164,000 white men registered to vote in Louisiana. By 1904, that number would sink to 91,716. Those who dropped from the rolls were mostly farmers and sharecroppers. It seemed that blacks and many poor whites now had yet another thing in common. Politically, they were powerless.
There's no news here except yellow fever and politics, and I don't know which is the greater curse. I prefer the fever.
Politicians realized that Louisiana had plenty of other things worth stealing besides votes, like money. And the best way to take people's money was to get them to hand it over freely. Of course, they didn't call it stealing. They called it a lottery.
The 19th century Louisiana Lottery was a private firm that had been given a monopoly on the numbers racket by the state legislature. They were notorious for paying off both sides of the aisle. Whether Republican or Democrat, it didn't make any difference. Whoever was in power was still beholden to the state lottery.
The corporation sold tickets nationwide, bringing in an estimated $20 to $30 million each year. Much less than half of that was paid out in prizes. That's why the Louisiana State Lottery Company could afford to make Louisiana's politicians the best bribe leaders in the country. At the center of the lottery's power was the state treasurer, an almost legendary rogue named Edward A. Burke.
He was, without question, one of the strongest figures during this period. And he's also, given the history of Louisiana, this may be an incredibly monumental achievement. He's probably the biggest crook the state has ever known.
Eventually, the federal government would bring down the lottery. As for Edward Burke, he disappeared in Honduras. An audit of the state treasury revealed that nearly $1.3 million had vanished with him. But while some got rich from stealing, others stubbornly insisted on doing things the hard way. That is, they made money by working for it.
The Iron Horse will speed its way from Shreveport to Louisville through Bossier Parish. The construction of the Shreveport and Arkansas Road will bring into market thousands of valuable acres of land. It's the earnest hope of the times that railroad construction has just begun in Bossier, and that in the course of a few years, every parish in North Louisiana will be traversed by several railways.
Investment in the railroad industry transformed rural Louisiana. Just as towns had sprung up along Louisiana's riverfronts in the century before, depot towns became vital ports along the state's growing stretch of railways.
The railroads were essentially built by national interests. The big railroad builders were the Goulds and the Fisk and the big-time investors. It was costly, but by the 1870s, railroads were pretty much crucial to transportation across Louisiana.
Most of Louisiana's people